The history of the Seattle Seahawks is a story written in the mist and in the deep, rhythmic vibrations of a stadium that literally shakes the earth. To understand the glory of February 8th, 2026, we must first go back 20 years to a time when Seattle was a quiet corner of the map, searching for a voice. 1984. No, wait. Let us settle into 2005. This was the year the Pacific Northwest finally believed. The Kingdome was a memory, and QQuest Field was a fortress of blue and neon green, under the steady professorial hand of Mike Holmgren. The Seahawks had built a machine. Imagine that offensive line. A wall of granite led by two future Hall of Famers, Walter Jones and Steve Hutchinson. They didn't just block, they moved the earth, creating wide, inviting lanes for the league's most valuable player, Shaun Alexander. Alexander moved with a strange, fluid grace, scoring 28 touchdowns that season, a record that seemed to shimmer in the damp Seattle air. At quarterback, Matt Hasselbeck was the conductor, playing with a fiery precision and an NFC-leading passer rating. They were the number 1 seed, 13-3. They were the highest-scoring offense in the National Football League, and for the first time in 30 years, the Emerald City was the center of the football universe. But the journey to greatness often ends in a hall of mirrors. Worse is can for Mice's Day, February 5th, 2006, Ford Field, Detroit, Super Bowl 40. Imagine the atmosphere. The stadium was a sea of terrible towels, a yellow and black storm that made the Seahawks feel like intruders at their own party. Pittsburgh was the 6th seed, a team of destiny playing for the legendary Jerome Bettis in his hometown. Seattle was the better team on paper, but the air in the building felt heavy, weighted by a narrative that the Seahawks weren't supposed to be there. The game began in a stutter, a defensive struggle that smelled of nerves and cold steel. Seattle struck first with a Josh Brown field goal, but the rhythm was never allowed to settle. This is where the haunting began. This is where the silver ghost of officiating started to drift across the turf. Late in the first quarter, Hasselbeck lofted a beautiful ball to Darrell Jackson in the end zone. A touchdown, or so we thought. A flag fluttered to the ground. Offensive pass interference. The replay showed a touch, a brush, nothing that usually stops a championship. The touchdown was erased. Seattle would settle for 3 points instead of 7, and the first crack in the foundation appeared. Then came the second quarter. Pittsburgh was struggling. Ben Roethlisberger was playing the worst game of his life, but on 3rd and goal, he dove for the line. He was stopped short, the ball clearly behind the white stripe. Yet, the signal came. Touchdown. Even with replay, the call stood. 7-3, Pittsburgh. The fans in Seattle, huddled in their living rooms, as the rain tapped against the glass, felt a familiar knot in their stomachs. It wasn't just that they were losing, it was that they weren't being allowed to win. The third quarter opened with a lightning strike. Willie Parker broke free for a 75-yard touchdown run, the longest in Super Bowl history. 14-3. The Seahawks were reeling, but they were not broken. Kelly Herndon intercepted Roethlisberger and returned it 76 yards, setting up a Jeremy Stevens touchdown. 14-10. The momentum was shifting. The 12s could feel the comeback, but the ghost was still there. Seattle was driving, moving into Pittsburgh territory. Hasselbeck threw a block on a play following an interception, a standard, gritty football play. The whistle blew. Hasselbeck was flagged for a low block, a penalty usually reserved for linemen. It pushed Seattle back, killing the drive, killing the hope. And then, the trick play. Antoine Rondell, a wide receiver with a quarterback's arm, took a reverse and launched a 43-yard bomb to Hines Ward, 21-10. The clock ticked away, but for Seattle, the game had ended long before the final whistle. Mike Holmgren stood on the sideline, his face a mask of purple frustration. He knew, the city knew. They hadn't just lost to the Steelers, they had lost to a series of moments they couldn't control. The aftermath was a long, cold silence. The NFL later admitted through referee Bill Levy that mistakes were made, that calls were missed. But you can't replay a dream. That loss in Detroit became the DNA of the franchise. It birthed the Seattle against the world mentality, the chip on the shoulder that would eventually grow into a roar. It was the end of the silver helmet era. Walter Jones would eventually retire, Sean Alexander would fade, and Matt Hasselbeck would move on. The Seahawks had reached the summit, only to be pushed off in the dark. They went back to the mist, back to being the team in the upper left corner that nobody respected. But in that darkness, the seeds of the Legion were being planted. The heartbreak of 2006 was the fuel for the fire that would burn a decade later. Sleep now. The silver ghosts are retreating into the fog. The stadium is quiet. The yellow towels have been folded away. The era of the pirate and the teacher is over. But the rain is still falling. And in the rain, something bigger is growing. After the heartbreak of 2006, the city of Seattle settled into a long, patient winter. They watched as the old guard faded away, and they waited for a sign that the upper left corner of the world would ever truly matter again. Then, in 2010, a man arrived with a silver shock of hair and a philosophy that felt like a California sunrise hitting the cold Pacific fog. Pete Carroll. He didn't just bring energy, he brought a transformation of the soul. He talked about always competing, about the power of belief, and he began to draft men who looked and played like they were built in a laboratory for defensive dominance. By 2011, the foundations were set. A group of young, hungry, and overlooked defensive backs were beginning to find each other. They were the outcasts of the scouting reports. A fifth-round safety from Virginia Tech named Cam Chancellor, a fifth-round cornerback from Stanford named Richard Sherman, a first-round blur of speed named Earl Thomas, together with Brandon Browner. They formed a secondary that didn't just play football. They patrolled it. They called themselves the Legion of Boom. Imagine the sound of the stadium during those years. CenturyLink Field, a place of concrete and steel designed to trap sound and amplify the spirit of the 12th man. It was no longer just a stadium. It was a seismic instrument. In 2011, during a playoff game against the Saints, the fans roared so loud after a Marshawn Lynch touchdown run that they literally triggered a seismograph nearby. The Beastquake wasn't just a play, it was the earth acknowledging that something new was born in Seattle. By 2013, the machine was perfect. At the center was a young quarterback who had been told he was too short to reach the stars. Russell Wilson. He played with a calm that bordered on the supernatural, a man who escaped pressure like a ghost escaping a locked room. Behind him was Marshawn Lynch, beast mode, a man who didn't run around defenders. He ran through them, as if they were made of paper. The 2013 Seahawks didn't just win, they dominated the psychology of the sport. They led the league in scoring defense, in yards allowed, and in takeaways. They were the first team to do all three since the legendary '85 Bears. They entered the playoffs as the #1 seed, the undisputed kings of the NFC. They fought through the New Orleans Saints in the wind. And then, the NFC Championship against their bitter rivals, the San Francisco 49ers. It was a heavyweight fight in the mud, with the game on the line. Richard Sherman tipped a pass into the hands of Malcolm Smith. The tip. It was the moment the door to the Super Bowl swung open once more. February 2nd, 2014, MetLife Stadium, New Jersey. Super Bowl 48. The world expected a clash of titans. On one side, the greatest offense in the history of the game, Peyton Manning and the Denver Broncos, a team that had scored over 600 points in a single season. On the other side, the dark side defense of the Seahawks. The media called it the unstoppable force versus the immovable object. The game was over in 12 seconds. On the very first play, the ball flew over Manning's head into the end zone. A safety. 2-0. Seattle. It was the fastest score in Super Bowl history, and it sent a message that the Broncos were not prepared for the storm that was coming. What followed was a 48-minute dismantling of a legend. Cam Chancellor set the tone early, hitting Demaryius Thomas so hard that the sound echoed through the rafters. Richard Sherman and Earl Thomas, turned the middle of the field into a no-fly zone. Every time Peyton Manning looked up, he saw a wall of blue and green that would not break. In the second quarter, Malcolm Smith intercepted a fluttering pass and ran it 69 yards for a touchdown. At halftime, it was 22-0. The world waited for the Manning comeback. Instead, they got the Percy Harvin dagger. On the opening kickoff of the second half, Harvin took the ball 87 yards, speeding past the entire Broncos team like a lightning bolt through the night. 29-0. The final score was 43-8. Russell Wilson was surgical, throwing for over 200 yards and 2 touchdowns. But the MVP was Malcolm Smith, the linebacker, a testament to a defense that had no weak links. Seattle had its crown. The championship parade was a sea of 2 million people gathered in the freezing February wind. They stood on top of police cars. They hung from balconies. They screamed until their voices were gone. The city wasn't just celebrating a win. They were celebrating the end of a 38-year exile. The Seahawks were no longer the forgotten team in the upper left corner. They were the blueprint. They were the Predators. They were champions of the world, and it felt as if the reign of the Legion would last forever. But as history has shown, the higher you climb, the harder the air is to breathe. And the next chapter would bring a lesson in the fragility of a dynasty. Sleep now. The roar of the parade is still ringing in the distance. The trophy is home. The city is at peace. They say that in the Pacific Northwest, the rain can wash away almost anything. It washes the dust from the cedar trees and the salt from the piers of Puget Sound. But there is one memory that no amount of rain has ever been able to scrub clean. It is a memory of a single yard and a single second that changed the history of the Seahawks forever. The year was 2015. The Seahawks were the kings of the world. They had spent the entire season proving that their championship in New Jersey was not a fluke. They had survived a legendary NFC championship game against Green Bay, a comeback so improbable it felt like divine intervention. They were heading to Glendale, Arizona for Super Bowl 49. They were on the verge of becoming the first team to win back-to-back titles in a decade. They were on the verge of becoming a dynasty. The opponent was the New England Patriots. The old guard versus the new. Tom Brady versus the Legion of Boom. It was a game played at the highest level of human capability. A heavyweight fight where every punch was answered with a counterpunch. By the fourth quarter, the world was breathless. Imagine the scene with 2 minutes left on the clock. The Seahawks were trailing 28-24. Russell Wilson, the man who always found a way, led the team down the field. Then came the catch. Jermaine Kearse, falling to the ground. The ball bouncing off his leg, his chest, his hands, and finally sticking. It was a miracle. It put the Seahawks on the 5-yard line. Imagine the scene with 2 minutes left on the clock. The stadium was vibrating. On first down, Marshawn Lynch took the ball and rumbled to the 1-yard line. 1 yard. Every person watching that game knew what was coming next. You have beast mode in the backfield. You have the most physical runner of a generation, a man who built a career on the philosophy that he would not be denied. You have 3 downs to gain 36 inches. The script was already written. Lynch would take the handoff, he would disappear into a pile of bodies, and he would emerge on the other side as a 2-time champion. But the script was torn up. The play call came in. 2nd and goal. Russell Wilson lined up in the shotgun. He took the snap. He looked to his right, and he fired a quick slant toward Ricardo Lockett. In that heartbeat, a young undrafted cornerback named Malcolm Butler moved. He didn't wait. He didn't hesitate. He saw the play before it happened. He stepped in front of the ball. Interception. The silence that followed was louder than any roar the 12s had ever produced. It was a vacuum of sound. It was the sound of a dynasty vanishing into the Arizona night. The fallout of that 1 yard was tectonic. It wasn't just a lost game. It was a fracture in the soul of the team. In the locker room, the questions began to whisper. Why didn't we run the ball? Why did we try to be too clever? The Legion of Boom, A brotherhood built on trust and violence felt the first cracks of doubt. The years that followed were a slow, lingering twilight. The core of the championship team began to drift away. Marshawn Lynch retired, then returned, then left again. Richard Sherman, the voice of the defense, was released after an injury. Earl Thomas left on a cart. Cam Chancellor was forced into retirement by the very violence he used to command. By 2022, the last pillar of the old world was gone. Russell Wilson was traded to the team he had once destroyed in the Super Bowl. The trade marked the official end of the greatest era in Seattle sports history. It was a divorce that left the city feeling older, quieter. The Seahawks became a team of good, but not great. They were competitive. They were gritty. But the ghost of the 1-yard line followed them into every stadium. Every time they got close to the red zone, the memory would resurface. Every time a coach mentioned a pass play near the goal line, Pete Carroll, the man of infinite optimism, kept chewing his gum, kept preaching the gospel of competition. But even he knew that the air had changed. In early 2024, the Carroll era finally came to an end. He left the stage as a hero, but a hero with a heavy shadow. The city of Seattle went back to the mist. The stadium was still loud, but the roar was different now. It was a roar of longing, a roar of a people who had seen the promised land and been turned away at the gates. They were waiting for someone who didn't care about the ghosts, someone who could look at that 1-yard line and see a beginning rather than an end. The 2020s were a wilderness of rebuilding and rediscovery, a search for a new identity that didn't rely on the echoes of the past. The architecture of pain was nearly complete. The city had suffered enough to appreciate the miracle that was about to unfold. Sleep now. The 1-yard line is still there, in the dark. The ghosts are still whispering, but the wind is shifting. A new sound is coming from the sound. A different kind of storm is brewing in the north, one that doesn't look back. It is February 8th, 2026, Santa Clara, California. Levi's Stadium is bathed in a cold, artificial light. But for the thousands of fans who traveled south from the Pacific Northwest, the air feels like home. The wilderness is finally over. The architecture of hope has been completed. To understand how we got here, to this victory over the New England Patriots, we have to look at the 2 years of quiet transformation that preceded it. When Mike McDonald arrived in Seattle in 2024, he didn't bring the loud, chaotic energy of the past. He brought the ice of the future. He was a man of cold logic and surgical defense, a mastermind who looked at the game like a complex equation to be solved. He didn't try to recreate the Legion of Boom. He built a unit known as the Dark Side, a defense that didn't just stop teams, it suffocated them. And then there was the quarterback, Sam Darnold. Imagine a man who had spent his career being called a bust, a man who had been cast aside by the Jets, the Panthers, the Niners, and the Vikings. In 2025, the Seahawks signed him to a 3-year deal that many experts mocked. But under the guidance of Clint Kubiak, Darnold found his peace. He didn't try to be a superstar. He simply became the conductor of a machine that didn't need him to be perfect, just precise. The 2025 season was a march of destiny. The Seahawks finished 14-3, the number 1 seed. They arrived at Super Bowl 60 with 60-1 odds still ringing in their ears. Facing them was a familiar ghost, the New England Patriots, led by their own young savior, Drake May. The game was not a shootout, it was a grind. It was a game that favored the tough, the patient, and the cold-blooded. For 3 quarters, the scoreboard was a testament to the dark side defense. Seattle didn't allow a single point. Jason Myers, the veteran kicker, became the heartbeat of the offense. 1 field goal, 2, 3. By the time he struck his 5th field goal, a Super Bowl record, the Seahawks held a 12-0 lead. It was a shutout that felt like a slow-motion strangulation. Drake May, the Patriots star, was trapped in a nightmare. He was sacked 6 times, hit 11 times, Devin Witherspoon was a menace, blitzing from the secondary like a lightning bolt through a dark sky. The breakthrough finally came in the fourth quarter, following a strip sack by Derek Hall. The Seahawks had the ball on the 16-yard line. Sam Darnold dropped back, calm, his eyes scanning the New England secondary. He lofted a soft, perfect pass to the corner of the end zone. A.J. Barner, the young tight end, went up and snatched it, 19-0. The Patriots tried to fight back. Drake May found Mac Hollins for a touchdown to break the shutout, but the Seahawks didn't blink. With less than 5 minutes to play, the ghosts of 2015 were finally laid to rest. Devin Witherspoon blitzed again, drilling May just as he prepared to throw. The ball tumbled into the air, and there was Uchenna Nwosu. He caught it in stride and rumbled 45 yards down the sideline. Touchdown. The stadium erupted in a sea of blue and green confetti. The final score was 29-13. Imagine the scene on the podium. Kenneth Walker III, the man who rushed for 135 yards, holds the MVP trophy. He is the first running back to win the award in 28 years, a throwback to a time when the ground game was king. Sam Darnold stands beside him. The man who was forgotten is now a champion. And Mike McDonald, the youngest coach to ever win it all, looks out at the 12s and simply says, "We believe in each other." Kenjer Feinpikovs looks out at 12s and simply says, "We believe in each other." The 1-yard line is no longer a scar. The interception in Arizona is finally buried beneath the turf of Santa Clara. The Seahawks have their second Lombardi trophy. They didn't just win a game, they won back their dignity. The Emerald City is glowing tonight. The Space Needle is lit in blue and green, piercing the clouds of the Northwest. The parade will return to the streets, moving from the Stadium District to the Seattle Center. And for every fan who remembers the snow in Detroit or the silence in Phoenix, the air is finally clear. The Pirates of the Pacific have returned to their throne. Sleep now. The long journey is over. The ghosts are at rest. The rain is falling on the cedar trees of the Sound. The stadium is dark, and the lights of the city are peaceful. The resurrection is complete. The dawn is here.